My name is Auntie Miriam. I am 82 years old, and as I sit by the window of this quiet little room, I often find myself drifting back through the corridors of memory. The world outside is fast, impatient, relentless, but here in my silence, time slows down, and I can hear the echoes of the sacrifices that shaped me. People see wrinkles on my face, perhaps weakness in my hands, but they do not see the nights I went without food so my children could eat, or the winters I endured with shoes so thin my feet nearly froze, all because I believed in a future brighter than the darkness I knew. I raised a son in this world, a boy who once clung to my skirt when thunder roared, who cried for me when fever gripped his small body. But time changes children. They grow tall, proud, unknowing of the weight their mothers carried. My son, now a man of strength and certainty, once looked at my struggles and laughed, not cruelly, but with the arrogance of someone who has never tasted real hunger or felt the burn of relentless sacrifice. His laughter cut deeper than any wound. It wasn't the laughter itself, but the blindness behind it, the blindness to the life I carved out of stone, the path I bled upon so he might walk freely. That was the day I decided to show him, to peel back the veil of comfort and let him see what sacrifice truly means. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the truth of my story, the story of a woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. And so, this is not just my memory, is a testament. Life was not gentle with me. It never offered me comfort wrapped in silk or blessings handed down without labor. My childhood was carved out of struggle, as if fate was determined to make me strong before I even knew what strength was. I was born in the late 1940s, in a world that was rebuilding itself after war. But in our small village, there was nothing resembling victory. Houses stood cracked and broken, food was scarce, and dreams were often traded for survival. My father was a farmer with calloused hands, the kind of man who bent his back under the sun until his skin turned the color of earth. My mother, a woman of iron beneath her soft eyes, stitched clothes by candlelight just so we could eat one more meal. I grew up in a house that shook when storms came, where the roof leaked during heavy rain, and where warmth in winter was something we prayed for more than we possessed. And yet, even in that poverty, there was dignity, a quiet resilience that said we may be poor, but we will endure. As a young girl, I often watched my mother's hands. They fascinated me. Those hands, lined with scars from the needle and burns from the stove, but always working, always giving. She taught me something without ever speaking it. Sacrifice is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is quiet and unseen, hidden in the corners where no one looks. I carried that lesson deep in my bones, though I did not yet know how heavy it would become. When I was old enough, I joined her work. My fingers bled from sewing, my shoulders ached from carrying water, but there was pride in contribution. Childhood was short, because survival left no room for dreaming. We did not ask what we wanted to be when we grew up, we simply grew up, because that was required of us. When I became a young woman, the world around me began to shift. Cities hummed with machines, factories opened their doors, and people migrated, in search of work. But where I lived, opportunities were scarce. Marriage was less a choice and more a passage into another form of survival. I was just 16 when my parents arranged for me to wed your father. He was not wealthy, but he had a kind smile and strong shoulders. He promised me safety, and in those days, safety was as precious as gold. We built a life with our bare hands, one small piece at a time. A room became a home. A patch of land became our harvest. And love, though tested by hardship, was the glue that kept us whole. But life is never still. Your father fell ill when our son was still a boy. His body grew weaker each passing year, and the burden of providing shifted onto my shoulders. I remember the first time I stood in the fields alone, holding the sickle, my hands trembling not from the weight of the tool, but from the enormity of what lay ahead. There was no choice. Hunger does not wait for sorrow to pass. I bent my back, under the same sun that had once worn my father down. My skin burned, my feet blistered, but I harvested until my arms could no longer lift. At night, when the house was quiet and your father coughed in the dark, I sat beside him and stitched clothes by lantern light, the same way my mother had once done. The circle of sacrifice had come full, and I bore it without question, because to stop would mean my son would go hungry. There were winters when the cold gnawed at our bones. I remember wrapping my son, your father's namesake, in every scrap of cloth I could find. While I wore little more than a threadbare shawl, I shivered through the nights so he could sleep warm. There were summers when the drought cracked the earth, when food became scarce and I gave him the last handful of rice while pretending I had already eaten. Hunger is sharp, it makes the body weak, but nothing compares to the hunger of a mother's heart when she fears she cannot provide. I prayed through those nights, whispering to God to give me strength, to let my boy survive, and he did. He grew strong, tall, clever with words, quick with laughter. I often watched him play with the other children, running barefoot across the dust, and I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride, because he was everything I worked for. Sorrow, because he did not know the cost of his carefree laughter. How could he? Children are meant to laugh, not to carry the weight of sacrifice. I never told him how many nights I stayed awake counting coins, deciding between medicine for his father or food for him. I never told him how many times I walked to the market, only to walk away empty-handed because prices rose higher than my hands could reach. These were my burdens, and I carried them alone. Years passed. My husband's health faded like the last ember of a fire. The day he left this world, I thought the ground would swallow me whole. But I could not collapse, because my son still needed me. I buried my grief under labor, under endless work, until even sorrow learned it could not break me. I became both mother and father, protector and provider. And slowly, through sweat and sleepless nights, my son's life began to open into something I never had: education, opportunities, the chance to dream beyond survival. I remember the first day he wore his school uniform, the white shirt, too big for his frame, the satchel dangling awkwardly from his shoulder. He was so proud, so eager, and I felt something swell inside me that I cannot put into words. It was worth it, I thought. Every hunger, every blister, every tear was worth this moment. He would live differently. He would not know the emptiness of cupboards, the cold of winter without blankets, the weight of work before youth had ripened. That was my vow, and I kept it. But as he grew older, the distance between us grew too. He became educated, sophisticated, a man who read books I could not pronounce and spoke of things I had never seen. He looked at the world with ambition, with confidence that came from never having to doubt where his next meal would come from. And sometimes, when I spoke of the past, of how we lived, of the struggles I endured, he would smile, even laugh, softly, as though those stories were exaggerations, relics of another world. To him, sacrifice was a word in a book, not a wound carried in the body. The day he laughed outright at my struggles, I felt something fracture inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, just a deep, aching sorrow. I had given everything so that he would never know the weight of hardship, but in protecting him from it, I had also shielded him from understanding it. My sacrifices had become invisible, and what is invisible is often dismissed. That night, I sat awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of our home, and I decided I would not let my story die in silence. He needed to know, not because I wanted gratitude, but because one day he, too, would face life's storms, and he needed to understand the roots of his strength. He needed to know that his laughter was built on my tears, that his ease was carved from my struggle. And so, I began to tell him, not in anger, but in truth. I told him of the winters when frost crept into our bones, of the summers when thirst split our lips, of the hunger that bent my spine and the grief that nearly broke me. I told him of his father's fading breath, of the coins I counted and recounted, of the choices no mother should ever have to make. I told him of the nights I prayed not for myself, but for him. As I spoke, I watched the laughter drain from his eyes, replaced by something heavier: understanding, perhaps even shame. But more than that, I saw recognition. He finally saw me, not just as his mother, but as the woman who built his world from nothing. You see, child, my life was not only shaped by the walls of our home, but by the world beyond, a world that was shifting, bleeding, and demanding sacrifice from every soul who lived through those years. The seasons of my youth were not painted with the colors of freedom and choice, but with the hues of survival. Even when my own hands were raw from work, even when my back bent under loads too heavy for a woman to carry, I knew my struggles were not mine alone. They were shared by an entire generation, especially the women who stood in the shadows, holding families together when everything else was falling apart. The 1950s and 1960s were not kind to our village. There were years of drought so severe, the riverbeds cracked into barren wounds, the earth refused to yield grain, and the air smelled of dust instead of harvest. Families who once had modest fields found themselves reduced to begging, and children with hollow eyes lined the paths like forgotten souls. I was young then, but I remember vividly the way hunger changed people, how it stripped them of laughter, how it made mothers cut their own portions to feed their children, how it forced fathers to leave home in search of labor in cities they had never seen. Famine was not just empty plates, it was a thief of dignity, stealing health, hope, and humanity. And yet, amidst that suffering, there was resilience. Women became the silent engines of endurance. I recall how the older women in the village would gather us younger ones and teach us ways to stretch a meal beyond imagination, grinding wild roots into flour, boiling bitter leaves to stave off hunger, making soups so thin you could see the bottom of the pot, yet serving it with pride so our children would believe they had been fed. We became magicians of survival. It was during those years I learned that sacrifice is not only what you give up, but what you create from nothing, so that others may live. War, brushed against our lives, even if it never raged directly in our fields. Soldiers marched through nearby towns, flags rose and fell, and rumors spread faster than fire. Fear was as common as the air we breathed. We heard stories of men taken, of women violated, of villages burned in the night. At any moment, we knew safety could be stolen. My husband was spared from conscription because of his illness, but many neighbors' sons vanished into uniforms they never returned from. And what did the mothers do? They grieved in silence, then went back to the fields, because tears do not put food on the table. I learned then that sacrifice is not only endurance, it is the ability to carry on when grief threatens to drown you. By the 1970s, when you were still small, migration became the song of survival. Men traveled to faraway lands in search of wages to send home. Some came back with stories of opportunity, others came back in wooden boxes. Women, once confined to the walls of homes, suddenly became the pillars of entire households. We tilled the land, raised children, cared for the sick, and handled without acknowledgement. The world looked at us as weak, but in truth, we were the spine holding everything upright. I carried water jars that weighed more than my body, walked miles barefoot to fetch firewood, stitched clothes by lantern until my eyes blurred on still. When the village gathered, it was the men who spoke of labor, as if women had done nothing. That invisibility, that silence is part of the sacrifice, too. When I tell you these things, my son, it is not to paint myself as a hero, but to give you sight. You live in a time when food fills your plate without question, when water runs from taps, when the cold is fought with heaters and blankets bought from markets. But in my day, survival was a war fought daily, silently, without recognition. You laughed once, saying, my stories sounded like exaggerations. Let me tell you, there was no exaggeration in the way children cried themselves to sleep from hunger. There was no exaggeration in the way women sold their only piece of jewelry, a wedding bangle or heirloom, just to buy a handful of rice. There was no exaggeration in the way people walked miles in the sun for a bucket of water, or in the way disease took lives simply because medicine was a luxury we could not afford. These were truths. They were the bones of our existence. I remember one particular year when you were perhaps 7 or 8, and cholera swept through the neighboring villages. It was merciless, striking the weak first, but sparing no one. Mothers buried children, husbands buried wives. Fear clung to the air like smoke, and every cough sounded like a death sentence. I did everything I could to shield you. I boiled water, obsessively, though firewood was scarce. I scrubbed your clothes until my hands bled. I whispered prayers over you every night, bargaining with God to spare you, even if it meant taking me. That was the year I learned that sacrifice is also vigilance, the constant, exhausting guard a mother keeps over her child. Never resting, never yielding, always watching for danger. You survived, thank God, but I aged 10 years in that single season. When you became a man and found laughter in my stories, perhaps you thought I told them as tales, as folklore from another time. But no, my son, they were my blood, my sweat, my scars. Sacrifice was not a choice for me. It was the air I breathed. If I had faltered, if I had grown weary and chosen rest, your life would not be what it is today. That is the truth. You walk on a path paved by the invisible labor of my hands, by the calluses that cracked open but kept working, by the nights I went hungry so you would not. And I do not tell you this to seek gratitude, but so that you understand the foundation upon which you stand. There is something else you must know. Sacrifice is not only what I gave for you, it is also what I surrendered of myself. I had dreams once, small though they were. I wanted to learn to read fully, to write letters without help. I wanted to sing without worrying if neighbors would scorn me for wasting time. I wanted to own a small shop, to sell the things I stitched, instead of giving them away for a few coins. But dreams require freedom, and freedom was a luxury I could not afford. So I folded my dreams carefully, like clothes kept in a trunk, and I locked them away so that yours might live. That, too, is sacrifice, the death of one's own future so another's may flourish. Even now, as I speak these words, I feel the weight of those buried dreams, but I do not regret them. For when I see you walking with pride, when I see the education you hold, when I see the life you are able to live without the shadows I endured, know it was worth it. Yet it pained me that you laughed, that you did not see. That is why I tell you these truths, in detail, with no veil to soften them, so you may never again dismiss sacrifice as a story, but recognize it as the very ground you walk upon. When I finally spoke all my truths, I thought perhaps you would grow restless, dismiss my words as old tales of a tired woman, but you did not. You sat there in silence, your laughter gone, your eyes lowered, and for the first time since you were a boy, you looked at me not as the old woman who nags, but as someone whose hands built the ground beneath your feet. That silence was heavier than words. I could see you tracing the lines of my face, perhaps realizing that each wrinkle was not age alone, but a map of sacrifices you had never known. The next day, something changed in you. You rose earlier than usual and sat beside me as I prepared the morning tea. I remember your hands fumbling with the kettle, unfamiliar with the weight of simple labor. You burned your fingers slightly, and when I reached out to take it from you, you shook your head, stubborn, almost ashamed. In that moment, I saw the boy you once were, stubborn in learning to walk, falling and rising, refusing help. Only now, it was not walking you wanted to learn, but understanding. And understanding, my son, is a heavier path than walking. You began to ask questions. Not the shallow ones, but those that reached into my past. What was it like, Ma, when you went hungry? How did you bear it? How did you work with no rest? And with each question, I saw the wall between us crumbling. I told you, detail by detail, about the nights I worked until my eyes refused to open, about the coins I hid in the folds of my blouse so thieves would not take them, about the mornings I woke before dawn to grind flour, even when my hands were blistered raw. You listened as if each word was a revelation, and I wondered if perhaps, at last, you could see me not only as the woman who birthed you, but as the soldier who fought a silent war, so you might never have to dot it. Was not long before you asked me to take you back to the places of my struggle. And so I agreed. Together we walked to the old fields, though my steps were slower now, and the land had changed. Where once the soil cracked with drought, now green shoots waved in the breeze. But I pointed to the corner where I once knelt, hands in the dirt, praying for rain. Here, I said softly, is where I bled from my fingers, just so you might have bread. Your eyes followed my gesture, and though the land was healed, your gaze seemed to see the wounds still buried in the soil. I took you to the old house where I grew up, its walls crumbling, its roof caved in. The air inside smelled of dust and memory. I touched the wooden beam where I once leaned as a child, hungry and tired, and I told you, this is where I learned that survival is not given, it is taken, piece by piece, with your own two hands. You walked the narrow corridor in silence, brushing your fingers against the broken plaster, and I could almost feel the weight settling into you, the knowledge that comfort is not inherited, it is earned by the sweat of those who came before. Do you remember, my son, when we passed the cemetery on our way home, the graves of the young boys who never returned from war, the women who died in childbirth, the old ones who starved during famine? You stopped before one grave, unmarked, overgrown with weeds, and asked me who it was. I told you it belonged to a woman named Amina, a neighbor of mine, who sold her last piece of jewelry to buy food for her children, only to die the following winter from sickness. You stood there for a long time, silent, perhaps realizing that sacrifice is not my story alone. It is the story of countless mothers, invisible, forgotten, buried without recognition. That evening, when we returned, you did something that took me by surprise. You sat at my feet, like you had not done since you were a child, and you held my hands. You studied the calluses the scars, the crooked fingers that had bent from years of sewing, and with a voice that trembled, you whispered, "Ma, I didn't know, I didn't see, forgive me." My heart ached, not from resentment, but from relief. For years I had carried the fear that my sacrifices would vanish unacknowledged, that the life I gave would be taken for granted. But in that moment, I knew my story had finally found its witness. You began to change after that. Slowly, but surely. You no longer laughed when I spoke of the past. Instead, you asked me to tell more, to record them, even, so your children might one day know. You brought me books and asked me to read with you, patient as I stumbled over words, determined to give me the chance I had buried for myself long ago. And when you worked, whether at your desk or in the yard, I saw a new weight in your movements, as if each act was now tethered to the knowledge of the sacrifices that made it possible. I tell you this, my son, not to glorify myself, but to remind you of what sacrifice truly means. It is not grand gestures, not loud declarations, not medals or applause. Sacrifice is silent. It is in the mother who eats last, in the father who breaks his back in the fields, in the sister who sells her jewelry, in the neighbor who shares her last loaf of bread. It is in the invisible threads that hold families, communities, even nations together. And though the world may never write our names in history books, our sacrifices live on in the lives we nurtured. You are living proof of mine down. As I sit here in the twilight of my years, I do not fear death. I do not fear the forgetting of my name, for I know the roots of my labor are planted deep within you. What I gave freely, and though it cost me everything, it gave you the chance to live differently. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any parent can leave, not wealth, not property, but the unseen sacrifices that allow the next generation to rise higher. So when you laughed at my struggles, my son, it pierced me, yes, but in truth, it gave me the chance to reveal to you the meaning of sacrifice, to lift the veil so you might see clearly. And now that you do, I am at peace. For you carry not just my name, but my story, my resilience, my sacrifice. And as long as you remember, as long as you live with the awareness of what was given, my life has not been in vain. And so, this is the truth I leave you with. Sacrifice is the foundation of every life that flourishes. It is unseen, unspoken, often unacknowledged, but it is real, and it is sacred. Never again laugh at it, my son. Instead, honor it, carry it, and when the time comes, pass it on.